What if I told you that everything you think you know about the assassins is a lie? That there was no hashish, no paradise gardens, no drug-addled fanatics eager to die for a promise of eternal bliss? All of it, merely a spectacular smokescreen, a smear campaign cooked up by their enemies and immortalized by Marco Polo, becoming one of history's most enduring hoaxes. The true story of the assassins isn't a tale of religious ecstasy. It's an intellectual thriller about the birth of the world's first professional intelligence agency. I invite you to become not just spectators, but investigators in a 900-year-old cold case. Together, we'll crack the code of the mountain fortress of Alamut and separate the ingenious doctrine of asymmetric warfare from the myth that has obscured the truth for centuries. Let's close our eyes for a moment and transport ourselves to the late 11th century, deep into the heart of the Seljuk Empire. Try to truly feel this world. The air here is thick and heavy, saturated with the scents of the desert, spices, and power. In the sun-baked streets of Isfahan or Baghdad, the fragrance of cardamom and saffron from the market mingles with the pungent odor of sweat from thousands of people and pack animals, the smoke from bakeries, and the sharp metallic tang from armorers' workshops. Ears pick up a discordant chorus, the drawn-out call of the muezzin from the minaret, the resonant clang of copper where artisans forge their masterpieces, the hushed haggling of merchants in dozens of tongues, Persian, Arabic, various Turkic dialects, and a quiet, barely discernible whisper. A whisper where politics, taxes, and heretics are discussed. This is a world of colossal, almost absolute power. The Seljuk Sultanate was the superpower of its age, stretching from the borders of Byzantium to the foothills of China. Its might was visible and tangible. Armies of gilman clad in steel, opulent palaces where the all-powerful vizier held court, and caravan routes along which silk, spices, and gold flowed. It seemed this system was eternal and impregnable. But upon closer inspection, deep fissures lay hidden beneath the golden brocade of imperial grandeur. This entire edifice rested on a fragile alliance between the Turkic military aristocracy, the sophisticated Persian bureaucracy, and the Arab clergy. And each of these forces had its own interests and its own version of the truth. To grasp the drama about to unfold, one must understand the era's fundamental operating system, the schism within Islam between Sunnis and Shias. To put it simply, Sunnis, who formed the overwhelming majority and were the bedrock of Seljuk power, believed the community's spiritual leader should be elected. Shias, on the other hand, were convinced that authority could only belong to the direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. For the ruling Sunni elite, Shias weren't merely opposition. They were heretics, schismatics, a living affront to the legitimacy of their rule. This wasn't just politics. It was a battle for the soul of Islam, for the one true path. Within Shiism, numerous currents existed, but the most radical, intellectually sophisticated, and passionately driven was the Ismaili movement. Their core concept was the Imam. For them, the Imam was more than just a descendant of the Prophet. He was an infallible, divinely inspired spiritual leader, the only one who could unlock the secret, esoteric meaning of the Quran. The Sultan's power in Isfahan was power over bodies, the power of the sword and gold. But true power, the power over souls, they believed, belonged to the Imam, hidden from the world, and service to him was the highest duty, superseding any other oath. This forged individuals with an entirely different moral compass, ready to sacrifice everything for their faith. And this is where the most precise and audacious analogy is born. Imagine the Seljuk Empire as a colossal, sluggish corporate monopolist like Microsoft in the 90s. It controls the entire market, dictates its rules, and seems poised to crush any competitor. But the organization Hasan-i Sabbah will create isn't another corporation trying to launch its own product. No, it's a brilliant hacker collective that has no intention of fighting Microsoft on its own turf. Instead, they find one single critical vulnerability at the very core of the Empire's operating system, and they prepare to deliver a precise, surgically accurate strike that will trigger a cascading system failure. So, what kind of world is this? It's a world of absolute power, confident in its invulnerability. It's a world where religious doctrine means more than life itself, and loyalty to an unseen leader is stronger than the fear of death. And into this world, steeped in secret animosity and the premonition of change, with a handful of followers and one revolutionary idea, steps a man who will change the rules of the game forever. His name is Hasan-i Sabbah, and he isn't going to build his own empire. He's going to hack someone else's. The starting point for our story wasn't the roar of battle, but the silence of a chase. In the mid-1080s, Hasan-i Sabbah was the most wanted man in Persia. He was a brilliant Ismaili preacher whose words converted entire villages, and for the imperial power, he was more dangerous than any army. Seljuk patrols scoured the country, and agents of the all-powerful Vizier Nizam al-Mulk were hot on his heels. His movement was dispersed, his followers intimidated. It seemed like the end. Anyone else in his shoes would have tried to flee, to hide, to lie low. But Hasan did something entirely different. He understood that defense and flight were paths to slow extinction. To survive, he had to attack. But how? And this is where we see the birth of his ingenious, at first glance, insane idea. Hasan couldn't raise an army to challenge the Sultan. That would have been suicide. He couldn't build his state on the plains. It would have been instantly wiped off the map. He needed something else. He needed a base. But not just any base. A fortress that would be a weapon in itself. Impregnable, self-sufficient, located in a strategically vital yet inaccessible region. A place from which to launch attacks, but one that would be impossible to reach. For 9 years, he traveled across Persia, changing disguises, studying geography, assessing fortresses, searching for his ideal staging ground. This was not an escape. It was methodical, cold reconnaissance. And he found it. In northern Persia, in the Alborz Mountains, atop a solitary rock over 6,500 feet high, stood the fortress of Alamut, the eagle's nest. It wasn't just a fortification, it was a geological masterpiece of defense. Only one narrow, winding path led to the fortress, coverable by dozens of firing points. The cliff face was so sheer that an assault was impossible. On the plateau at the summit were fields and springs, allowing it to withstand any siege, even one lasting for many years. Alamut was the perfect embodiment of Hasan's doctrine. Absolute security within and complete control over the surrounding territories without. It was the pivot point from which to turn the world upside down. Here, in the shadow of Alamut, his revolutionary plan finally crystallized. Hasan-i Sabbah, perhaps for the first time in history, recognized and articulated the principles of asymmetric warfare. He couldn't win, and he knew it. The Seljuk Empire could field hundreds of thousands of warriors, while he had only hundreds of loyal followers. Therefore, the battlefield itself had to change. He decided to shift the war from battlefields to the minds of his enemies. His targets were not armies and cities, but centers of decision-making. His weapon, not a sword, but a dagger. His main strength, not numbers, but intellect, patience, and the fear he would sow in the hearts of the powerful. Presenting this plan would have had the effect of an exploded bomb on his contemporaries had he voiced it. But Hasan was a man of action. He seized Alamut, and the way he did it became the first practical lesson of his new doctrine. He didn't lead an army. He didn't launch an assault. He infiltrated the garrison with his preachers. Month after month, they secretly converted soldiers to their cause. When most of the garrison was already on his side, Hasan simply walked into the fortress through the main gate. The Seljuk loyal commandant realized with horror that his stronghold no longer belonged to him. Hasan didn't kill him. He simply wrote him a check for 3,000 gold dinars and politely asked him to leave. News of this event echoed throughout Persia. For the Ismailis, it was a miracle, a sign from above. Their persecuted leader had not merely found refuge, he had wrested it from the all-powerful empire without shedding a single drop of blood. For the Seljuk authorities, it was unheard of audacity and public humiliation. Some heretic they had been chasing across the country had not only captured a strategic fortress, he had done it with mocking ease, demonstrating the complete impotence of the imperial machine. They still didn't grasp the full scale of the threat, but they already felt the icy breath of something new and utterly alien to their understanding of warfare. From that moment on, Hasan-i Sabbah ceased to be merely a preacher. He became Sayyidna, our master, and in the European tradition, he was remembered as the old man of the mountain. From his eagle's nest, he challenged a superpower. This wasn't a war for territory, it was a war of ideas, a war of wills, a war of nerves. And his operatives, whom he would begin training within the walls of Alamut, would go down in history under a name that would become synonymous with fear and inevitability. Their name, Assassins. So, how did this tiny organization, confined to a mountain fortress, manage to challenge a colossal empire? Marco Polo's myth offers a simple and lazy answer: drugs and deception. But the truth is far more complex and interesting. Hasan-i Sabbah's system was not a sect of fanatics. It was a living neural network, extending its invisible synapses across the entire Middle East. If the Seljuk Empire was a huge, muscular, but cumbersome body, then the Order of Assassins became its nervous system, capable of delivering a precise strike to the most vital node to paralyze the entire machine. Let's look under the hood of this mechanism and break down how it worked. It all started with selection. Hasan didn't recruit crowds. He didn't need disposable pawns, but highly specialized individuals. His preachers, or da'is, who traveled throughout the empire, were both recruiters and intelligence gatherers. They weren't just looking for believers, they were looking for young people with a particular set of qualities: a sharp mind, iron self-control, physical endurance, and most importantly, a deep, almost philosophical sense of injustice that power had been usurped by unrighteous sultans. The candidate underwent lengthy interviews and vetting. He wasn't lured into paradise, he was drawn into an intellectual and spiritual quest, proving that their doctrine was, in fact, the truth. If a candidate passed selection, he entered Alamut, or another fortress academy. And here began a multi-year training program that made Spartan upbringing seem like summer camp. This wasn't just military drill. The future Fidai, one who sacrifices himself, studied theology, not only his own, but also that of the enemy, to be able to debate and persuade. He mastered the languages and dialects of the regions where he might be sent. He studied political structures, court intrigues, and the genealogies of noble families. He was taught the art of disguise. He could spend years playing the role of a merchant, a dervish, a stable hand, or a court poet. And only at the very end of this journey came instruction in weaponry, primarily the dagger. But how do you compel a person to embrace certain death? Ideology was the operating system of this neural network. At the center of everything was the idea of absolute devotion to the Imam, whose earthly representative was Hasan. For the Fidai, this loyalty transcended all human laws and the instinct for self-preservation. Their mission wasn't murder in our understanding. It was an act of ultimate justice, almost a liturgical ritual, the fulfillment of divine will. Death during a mission was not a tragedy, but a triumph, the pinnacle of a spiritual journey, a moment of merging with absolute truth. They did not fear death because, in their frame of reference, it was not an end, but a culmination. Now, let's visualize a typical operation, breaking it down step by step. Step 1. Target selection. The target was never random. It was always a key element of the enemy system, not just any emir, but one whose death would spark a power struggle in a province, Not just any judge, but one who had handed down the harshest sentence against the Ismailis, and of course the ultimate target, Vizier Nizam al-Mulk himself, the brain and architect of the Seljuk Empire. The decision was made in Alamut based on data collected over decades by an extensive spy network. Step 2. Infiltration and incubation. A single fedai, or at most two, would be dispatched for the mission. Their primary objective wasn't to storm in and strike, but to utterly vanish into the target's orbit. They might secure a position as a palace guard, a servant in a nobleman's household, or a vendor in a market the target frequented. This intricate dance could unfold over months, sometimes even years. During this prolonged period, the fedai meticulously catalogued everything: the target's daily routine, personal habits, travel routes, security arrangements, strengths, and vulnerabilities. They became an invisible thread in the tapestry of daily life, a figure so unremarkable no one gave them a second glance. This wasn't born of mere fanaticism, but of a superhuman wellspring of patience and self-control. Step 3, and the most pivotal, the strike. The attack invariably erupted in the most public of venues: a mosque during Friday prayers, a bustling city square, or the grand reception hall of a palace. Their sole weapon was always a dagger. Why a dagger, you might ask? Because this was no mere act of elimination. It was a carefully choreographed spectacle, a searing message etched in blood. While poison or an arrow launched from a distance might have proven more efficient, they would have utterly lacked the crucial psychological punch. The fedai was expected to breach security, deliver the fatal blow before a multitude of witnesses, and almost without exception, perish on the spot, never even attempting to flee. Their death was an integral part of that chilling message which declared, "Behold, we are unstoppable. We embrace death. There is no defense against us. Even here, in the very heart of your power, you stand utterly defenseless." It was this public act of ultimate self-sacrifice that hammered a paralyzing terror into the hearts of their adversaries. We often laud the genius of Hasan-i Sabbah, dissecting his doctrine and strategy. Yet, even the grandest ideas remain inert whispers without the human will to breathe life into them. Let's descend from the lofty heights of strategy to the gritty earth and view this narrative through the eyes of an ordinary fedai. Picture, if you will, a young man hailing from a Persian village. Over 10 years of service to the order, he might have traversed a distance on foot equivalent to the journey from Cairo to Samarkand. He lived beneath assumed names, spoke foreign tongues, and observed alien rituals. For years, he would observe his target, study them, perhaps even harbor complex human emotions toward them. All this for one solitary moment, a single dagger thrust that would be his first and final act in that clandestine role. This demanded not mere belief, but a complete re-engineering of the human psyche. But behind every executing fedai stood an entire unseen army, without whom their mission would have been an impossibility. We will never know their names, yet they were the true, indispensable cogs in this formidable machine. Consider, for instance, the da'i, the proselytizers. These were no mere agitators. They were brilliant intellectuals, shrewd diplomats, and astute psychologists. A man named Hussein al-Kaini spent decades meticulously weaving an underground network of Ismailis in Kohistan, a region in eastern Persia. He didn't seize fortresses through brute force, he acquired them with the persuasive power of his words. He would arrive in a town, take up work as an artisan or a teacher, cultivate trust, and then, upon finding receptive minds, commence his compelling sermons. As a result, entire towns and fortresses peacefully transitioned under Alamut's control, becoming new vital nodes in their sprawling network. And then there was the intricate dance of logistics. How could a minuscule state, nestled precariously in the mountains, fund such extensive intelligence and subversive operations across an entire continent? One of Hassan's pivotal figures was his treasurer, known to us only by his official title. He engineered a labyrinthine system for collecting religious taxes from clandestine Ismaili communities scattered across the vast empire. The funds flowed through a meticulously vetted chain of trusted merchants, money changers, and pilgrims. This was an ancient, yet astoundingly effective financial web, operating directly under the very noses of the imperial tax authorities. Without these vital coffers, without this financial wizardry, the order would not have endured even 10 years. They didn't just pray, they knew how to count every single coin. Or let's consider Alamut's engineers. After the fortress was captured, Hasan-i Sabbah initiated an epic construction project. They engineered cutting-edge systems, truly unique for their era, to collect and store rainwater in cisterns hewn directly into the rock. Terraced fields and gardens were meticulously carved out, rendering the fortress completely self-sufficient in terms of sustenance. Legends whisper that Hasan, over 35 years of his reign, descended from his room to the fortress roof only twice. All that time, he was reading, writing, planning, and governing. Yet, his command to forge an ideal life support system was executed by anonymous engineers and builders who transformed a barren crag into an autonomous ark. And now, for a striking everyday detail that truly grounds this entire magnificent history. Alamut boasted one of the greatest libraries of its time. Hasan lavished immense sums on acquiring and copying the rarest manuscripts on philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and, naturally, theology. When a Fedai embarked on a multi-year assignment, say, to Syria, they received more than just a dagger and money. They were given an encrypted letter, serving as their password to connect with the local cell. And within that cell, they found not only shelter and sustenance, but also access to a library. The order cared not just for the physical well-being, but also the intellectual vitality of its agents. They were expected to constantly learn, evolve, and remain a cut above their surroundings. This was an organization of intellectuals who had chosen the dagger as their primary weapon. Thus, behind the formidable figure of each legendary assassin who struck fear into the hearts of sultans and kings, stood a vast and intricate structure. The intellectual recruiters, the financial geniuses, the innovative engineers, and of course, Hasan-i Sabbah himself, a man who sat in his mountain cell like a spider at the center of its web, sensing every tremor along the threads that stretched for thousands of miles around him. By the mid-13th century, the Order of Assassins seemed destined to endure forever. A century and a half had passed since Hasan-i Sabbah seized Alamut. During that span, several generations of rulers had come and gone. The Seljuk Empire, their primary foe, had weakened and splintered. Crusaders had arrived and departed, but the assassins remained. Their fortress nests, scattered across the mountains of Persia and Syria, were impregnable. Their dagger still represented the most potent argument in Middle Eastern politics. Their reputation was so utterly sinister that many rulers opted to pay them tribute, simply to be left in peace. The system hummed along like clockwork. It appeared invincible. But from the east, a perfect storm was brewing, a force with which Hasan's system had never contended, a force that simply refused to play by any rules. These were the Mongols. To the people of Persia, they were akin to a hurricane or an earthquake, a natural disaster devoid of comprehensible logic or human emotion. This wasn't just another army. This was an entirely different civilization, a completely alien philosophy of warfare. They cared nothing for dynastic intrigues, religious squabbles, or political alliances. Their logic was brutally simple: absolute submission or absolute annihilation. Cities that dared to resist were razed to the ground. Entire peoples vanished. And here, the cruel dialectic of history revealed itself. The very strength that had rendered the assassins invincible in their world proved utterly useless in the face of this new adversary. The Order's chief weapon was fear, predicated on targeted elimination. Assassinating a vizier or an emir would plunge a court into chaos, spark power struggles, and paralyze a state for months. But how do you frighten the Mongols? Kill one general? Another, even more ruthless, would instantly step into his place, armed with orders for vengeance. Attempt to eliminate the great Khan Monka in distant Karakoram? That would be like trying to kill an idea. The Mongol war machine was not an army beholden to a single leader, but an impersonal, self-replicating engine of total warfare. They could not be blackmailed. They could not be intimidated. The second pillar of assassin power, their impregnable fortresses, also transformed from a strength into a critical vulnerability. Alamut could withstand any siege by a Seljuk army, which, after a year or two, would inevitably retreat due to supply issues or internal strife. But the Mongols were different. They brought with them Chinese engineers, siege specialists, whose expertise was entirely unprecedented in these lands. They could encircle dozens of fortresses simultaneously and maintain a siege for years, methodically constructing catapults and siege towers. The fortresses, once havens of safety, transmuted into stone traps. The very isolation that once offered security now meant there was no hope of aid from anywhere. Realizing the mortal threat, the assassins attempted to employ their old methods. A detachment of their finest fedayeen was dispatched to the Mongol capital, Karakoram, with the mission to eliminate Khan Monka. It was a mission born of desperation. But the world had shifted. Mongol counterintelligence proved flawlessly efficient. The agents were apprehended and executed long before they could even approach their target. At that moment, in Alamut, a chilling sense of powerlessness must have been felt for the very first time. Their surgical scalpel was utterly useless against the armored steamroller that was advancing to crush their world. A colossal army, under the command of Khan Hulagu, Genghis Khan's grandson, swept into Persia with one singular objective: to obliterate the Nizari Ismaili state. The Mongols didn't storm one fortress after another. They encircled all of them, severing every line of communication. Alamut's last ruler, the young Imam Rukn al-Din Kusha, faced an impossible choice: fight to the very last stone and condemn tens of thousands of his followers, including women and children, to inevitable and agonizing deaths, or surrender in exchange for a nebulous promise of mercy. The system, built upon a contempt for death, confronted the specter of total genocide, and the order's will wavered. After a brief siege, under the relentless pressure of Mongol catapults and the stark realization of utter hopelessness, Rukn al-Din Kusha surrendered Alamut. The gates of the fortress, which for nearly 2 centuries had symbolized an unyielding spirit and independence, swung open before the conquerors. And in that ringing silence of capitulation hung the crucial, fatal question: would Genghis Khan's descendant keep his word and spare the lives of those who had voluntarily handed him their greatest treasure? Behind every grand historical narrative lie multiple versions of the truth, and the story of the assassins is no exception. It's time for intellectual honesty, to concede that for centuries, the world has favored the simplest and most alluring of these versions. The theory, of course, of Marco Polo's paradisiacal garden. Why has it proven so incredibly tenacious? Because it offered a convenient explanation for a phenomenon that simply defied comprehension. How could one willingly embrace death? The answer, they were drugged and deceived, is simple, understandable, and absolves one from acknowledging that ideology, faith, and cold calculation can be far stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. This version transformed brilliant strategists into exotic cultists and their followers into spineless puppets, a narrative far more comforting for their enemies and for European chroniclers alike. However, among contemporary historians, such as Farhad Daftari, there exists another, more complex theory that transcends a simple analogy to an intelligence agency. According to this perspective, the Nizari state was not merely a defensive enclave. It was history's first attempt to forge a transnational revolutionary network. Their goal was not mere survival, but the overthrow of the existing world order, the Sunni Seljuk Caliphate, and the establishment of their true imam's authority. In this framework, each assassination was not an act of terror, but an act of revolutionary justice, a surgical strike against the pillars of what they perceived as a rotten regime. They saw themselves not as murderers, but as surgeons excising cancerous tumors from the body of the Islamic world. But even the most ideologically driven structure demands resources. Where did a mountain-isolated order acquire its funding? The assassins' financial system was as masterful a work of covert operations as their assassinations. The bedrock of their economy was a rigorous religious tax, secretly collected from Ismaili communities scattered throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. Imagine a sprawling, invisible revenue service operating in tandem with the imperial one. The collected funds flowed into Alamut through a network of trusted merchants, pilgrims, and Sufi mystics. This system was built upon absolute trust and ideological fealty, rendering it virtually impervious to the Sultanate's fiscal authorities. Let's try to grasp the sheer scale of this economy through a comparison. A single military campaign by the Seljuks against a rebellious emir could drain the royal coffers of millions of dinars and drag on for years. Now, consider the economic impact of the assassins' actions. The assassination of the all-powerful vizier Nizam al-Mulk cost the order the life of one Fedayeen and the considerable expense of his years of training. But the fallout from this single death was a multi-year civil war between the Sultan's sons, a conflict that cost the Seljuk Empire hundreds of thousands of lives and plunged it into an abyss of chaos from which it never truly recovered. From an economic efficiency standpoint, a single assassin's dagger was more cost-effective than an entire army. They waged war with minimal outlay and maximum devastation for their adversaries. Yet, beyond the sheer economics, their actions were primarily driven by symbolic capital. Every operation was meticulously orchestrated as a message. Hassan's marriage to the local ruler's daughter wasn't just an alliance, it was a clear signal to regional elites. I am not an outsider, I am one of you, and I am here to stay. The very choice of the dagger as their primary weapon was profoundly symbolic. Poison, the weapon of a coward. The bow, the weapon of a distant warrior. The dagger, however, was the weapon of a judge. It demanded personal contact, a final chilling gaze into the victim's eyes. This transformed an assassination into a personal verdict, delivered right in a palace or a mosque, in full public view. What's more, there are documented instances where the assassins leveraged their greatest asset, fear itself, without resorting to violence at all. Legend has it that the mighty Sultan Sanjar, who was preparing a campaign against Alamut, awoke one morning to find a dagger plunged into the ground beside his bed. Alongside it lay a note. Wouldn't it be better for your well-being that this be plunged into the hard ground rather than into your soft chest? The campaign was immediately called off. This was no mere threat. This was pure, unadulterated terror. The message was crystal clear. We can reach you anywhere, anytime, even in your own bedroom, past your most elite guards. Your life is in our hands, and we grant it to you, for now. And now, as we've meticulously dissected the assassins' military tactics, their financial system, their ideological bedrock, and the chilling psychological warfare they waged, the full picture finally begins to coalesce. We've seen how their impregnable fortresses served as their shield, and the doctrine of asymmetric warfare their sword. We've understood that behind every dagger strike lay years of meticulous preparation, intricate logistics, and unshakable faith. But if we weave all these threads together, we realize that the ultimate secret to their 2-century dominion over fear wasn't found in any single element. It was in the ingenious synthesis of it all. So, what then was the true enigma behind Hasan-i Sabbah and his order? He wasn't merely a religious leader, a military commander, or a spy master. His genius lay elsewhere. He forged history's first truly hybrid organization. He took the fervent faith and rigorous discipline of a monastic order, blended it with the intelligence network of a secret society, and applied to it the tactics and strategy of a professional intelligence agency. The assassins were simultaneously a church, a state, an army, and an intelligence service. Each of these components amplified the others, creating a system unparalleled in the world of its time. His enemies simply failed to grasp what they were truly up against. Seljuk generals tried to fight them like a conventional army, besieging fortresses, and lost because the assassins didn't wage war on battlefields. Sunni theologians attempted to combat them as a heresy, issuing condemnatory treatises, and failed because words could not stop a dagger. Politicians tried to negotiate or intimidate and failed because for the assassins, death was no deterrent. They were a systemic glitch, a virus in the operating system of the medieval world, which used the very strength and rules of that system against itself. Hasan-i Sabbah was the first to grasp the fundamental asymmetry between brute force and sheer will. He understood that a vast, unwieldy empire had thousands of soft spots, the ambitions of its generals, the rampant corruption of its officials, the ruler's own gnawing fear for his life. In contrast, his order possessed only one, yet unbreakable power, the concentrated will of its followers, amplified by intellect and discipline. And he directed this laser-focused resolve straight at the empire's most vulnerable points. He wasn't trying to obliterate his enemy, he was trying to control it. At the heart of it all lay a cold, almost mathematical calculation. Hasan and his successors forged what today we might call a doctrine of managed chaos. Every single action wasn't aimed at seizing territory, but at reshaping the political landscape in their favor. Assassinating a tyrant so a more pliable ruler might take his place. Provoking a conflict between two hostile emirs to ensure they weakened each other. Selling their services to one side in a civil war to reap political or financial dividends. And when we truly grasp this, the entire history unfurls in a new light. This is no longer simply the defense of a small sect. This is a design of titanic, almost divine ambition, to manage political processes across an entire continent from a mountain stronghold without an army. To wield fear as a tool, politics as a chessboard, and one's followers as pawns willing to sacrifice themselves for victory in the grand game. They weren't merely sectarians, they were the architects of dread. They weren't just assassins. They were history's first political engineers who understood that one precise strike at the right moment could alter the course of history more effectively than thousands of soldiers. And in this chilling realization lies their primary, terrifying, and captivating secret. That's why, when the Mongols razed Alamut, they didn't just destroy a fortress, they obliterated a unique civilization, a brilliant and terrifying idea that was centuries ahead of its time. They burned a library, but the idea itself, like a phoenix, was destined to rise from the ashes in entirely different eras and in vastly different forms. When Hulagu Khan's Mongol army burned Alamut to the ground in 1256, they believed they were wiping the very memory of the assassins from the face of the earth. They tore down walls, destroyed a one-of-a-kind library, and executed thousands of followers. They annihilated the hardware, the physical manifestation of the order. But they couldn't destroy the software, the idea itself, the doctrine, which proved far more resilient than stone and steel. This idea seeped through cordons, carried across the world by rumors, legends, and diplomatic reports. The Crusaders, who clashed with the Syrian assassins, brought back to Europe not just terror, but knowledge of a new, inscrutable way of waging war, where one person with a dagger could be more formidable than an entire army. The domino effect had begun. Centuries later, as European nations began to form their own covert agencies, they, without consciously realizing it, largely followed in Hasan-i Sabbah's footsteps. Deep infiltration of an agent, years of rigorous training, intelligence gathering, the targeted elimination of a key figure to achieve political objectives without declaring war. All of these became the gold standard of intelligence operations. When the Mossad tracks and neutralizes enemies of the state across the globe, when CIA agents orchestrate regime changes, when special forces conduct surgical operations to decapitate terrorist cells, they are all, in essence, employing a modernized, secularized, and technologically enhanced doctrine born in a mountain cell of Alamut 9 centuries ago. The legacy of the old man of the mountain wasn't inscribed in books. It was written into the operational manuals of the most secretive and powerful organizations of the modern world. But there's also a more obvious legacy that we use every day. The word itself, assassin. It has traveled an incredible journey. Originally, it was a derogatory nickname, hashishin, hashish user, coined by their Sunni enemies to discredit the order, portraying them as drug-addled fanatics. Through the Crusaders, this word entered European languages, and today, assassin in English, assassin in French, or asesino in Spanish doesn't simply mean any killer, but a professional acting for political or ideological motives. A word invented as an insult became their eternal name, cementing enemy propaganda in our lexicon. And in the 21st century, the assassins experienced a second, utterly unexpected rebirth, becoming icons of popular culture. We are, of course, talking about the Assassin's Creed game series. For tens of millions of people worldwide, this fictional image, a noble freedom fighter in a stylish hood, has become the perceived true history of the Order. A video game has done more to popularize the myth of the assassins than all historical monographs combined. And now, in the minds of millions, the real, complex and far darker history of the Nizari state has been supplanted by a beautiful and heroic legend. And here, we arrive at the central paradox of their legacy. Hasan-i Sabbah's original idea was to create an elite order of intellectuals who used surgically precise violence as a last resort of political pressure. But over the centuries, this idea was distorted beyond recognition. The legend, born from their enemies and embellished by Marco Polo, transformed them into mindless fanatics, drugged into obedience. Myth trumped reality. The most successful propaganda campaign against them proved to be the one that outlived them by centuries and shaped their image in history. But there is yet another, darker paradox. Their method, the self-sacrificial attack on a symbol of power, was horrifyingly copied and perverted by modern terrorism. While the assassins almost always struck at a specific powerful individual, a vizier, a sultan, a prince, their modern imitators aimed their weapons at defenseless crowds. The surgical scalpel, intended to remove a specific tumor in power, transformed into a fragmentation bomb, whose purpose is to sow maximum terror through the mass murder of innocents. The great and terrible doctrine of asymmetric warfare, having survived centuries, evolved into its most grotesque opposite. What could we, people of the 21st century, possibly have in common with the inhabitants of medieval Persia? We live in a world of technology, instant communication, and, as we believe, boundless access to information. But it is precisely here that the most unexpected and crucial bridge to modernity lies. The Seljuk Empire, much like our own world, was inundated with information. Rumors from caravan routes, spy reports, religious sermons, court gossip. And in this informational din, it was just as hard then as it is today to distinguish truth from artfully crafted lies. The story of the assassins isn't just a history lesson, it's a masterclass in information warfare. Consider the legend of Marco Polo. It's a perfect example of viral content, a medieval fake news story that proved astonishingly resilient. Why? Because it was brilliantly packaged. It offered a simple, understandable explanation for a complex phenomenon. It was exotic, terrifying, and flattered its European audience by portraying the treacherous Saracens as wild and irrational. This story wasn't just a lie, it was a good product that satisfied the audience's demand for sensation. And in this lies the main, non-trivial lesson of this entire history, a lesson that doesn't just speak to the past, but directly to us. The lesson isn't merely that history is written by the victors. That's far too simplistic. The real lesson is that history belongs to whoever tells the best, most compelling story, even if it's pure fiction. And we, as consumers of information, are far more eager to believe in a simple, vivid myth than in complex, nuanced truth. It's easier for us to swallow the tale of drug-addled zombies than to acknowledge the existence of a brilliant and ruthless intelligence agency built on ideology and intellect. The story of the assassins is a mirror reflecting our own vulnerability to manipulation. They didn't lose to Mongol swords. In the long run, they lost to the pen of a Venetian merchant. Their true legacy, the doctrine of asymmetric warfare, their intellectual prowess, their unique state, was buried beneath the ruins of Alamut. What survived and endured for centuries was their caricatured, demonized image crafted by their enemies. They won the battle for fear, but they lost the war for the narrative. And that proved to be a far more devastating defeat. Today, as our reality is shaped by the algorithms of social media, as propaganda is cloaked in entertaining content, and as any conspiracy theory can rally millions of adherents overnight, this lesson is more relevant than ever. The story of the assassins reminds us that the most crucial battlefield isn't on the ground, but in the space between our ears. Mastery over minds, over what people believe, this is the true, ultimate form of power. And witnessing how a captivating lie outlived complex truth by 7 centuries, one simple, terrifying truth dawns on you. Perhaps the sharpest dagger in history isn't forged from steel, but one woven from words, a brilliantly told lie. Now, let's perform the most crucial intellectual somersault. Let's cross over to the other side. For a moment, let's forget the genius of Hasan and step into the shoes of Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire. We are not sitting in the austere cell of Alamut, but on a luxurious divan in Isfahan with the fates of millions at our command. We are the architects and custodians of the greatest power of our time. Our civilization isn't merely power. It is order brought to lands torn by centuries of infighting. It is the madrasa universities we build across the empire. It is the poetry of Omar Khayyam that echoes through our court. It is justice founded on the laws of orthodox Sunni Islam. We are not villains. We are the gardeners tending the fragile garden of civilization amidst a wild world. And into this garden, a weed appears. A strange sect of heretics who call themselves the people of the foundation. They don't field an army. They don't demand negotiations. They simply begin to kill. They kill the best among us, governors, generals, judges. And for us, this isn't just war. This is a defilement. In our culture, the culture of Turkic warriors and Persian aristocrats, there is a code of honor. War is an open field. It is a clash of armies. It is a duel between equals. But what do they do? Their followers pretend to be our servants for years, eating our bread, and then plunge a dagger into our backs during prayer. In our world, this is not valor. This is the ultimate depth of depravity and cowardice. Let's imagine the cultural shock of a Seljuk warrior seeing this for the first time. There he stands, a veteran of dozens of battles, on guard for the emir. Suddenly, a dervish, whom everyone has seen in the square hundreds of times, lunges forward. He doesn't try to take the emir hostage. He doesn't shout demands. He simply delivers one blow, and then, with a chilling, inhuman smile, allows himself to be torn to pieces. For the warrior, this isn't an act of faith. This is pure madness. These aren't people. These are some sort of demon-possessed creatures whose minds are poisoned by heresy and, as whispers ripple across the empire, by hashish. We don't understand their motivations, their logic. They operate beyond our understanding of war, honor, and even human nature. And in this misunderstanding lies the tragedy of our predictability. We are a great empire, and when we face a threat, we act like a great empire. We gather an enormous army and send it into the mountains to root out this nest of heretics. It is logical. It is right. Every empire before us did the same. But this very might, this very logic, becomes our greatest weakness. Our army is a hammer, crafted to crush other hammers. But we're trying to swat a virus with it. We besiege their fortresses, losing thousands of lives in futile assaults, while in the capital, thousands of miles from the front, a new dagger finds a new target. Our strength lies in order, in hierarchy, in clear structure. We know who the enemy is. He stands before us with a sword. But how do you wage war against an enemy with no face? Who could be your barber, your stable hand, your cook? Our state apparatus, accustomed to warring with states, was utterly unprepared to combat a network. Our immune system, perfectly tuned to fight external threats, had no answer for the cancerous cells that began to devour the body from within. Nizam al-Mulk, one of the greatest political minds of his era, penned an entire treatise, the Book of Government, meticulously dissecting all threats to the state. But even he, with all his intellect, saw the assassins merely as a dangerous heresy to be crushed by force. He never grasped that he faced not just a sect, but a new, revolutionary technology of power that rendered his own system, based on armies and bureaucracy, obsolete and unwieldy. And he himself became its first and primary victim, falling to the dagger of a Fidai disguised as a Sufi mystic. The great guardian of order was slain by the weapon of absolute chaos. Behind the facade of an unyielding genius and ascetic who ruled the order for 35 years lay a figure of Shakespearean proportions. Hasan-i Sabbah forged a system built on absolute loyalty and iron discipline. But to maintain this system, he had to make decisions of monstrous, almost inhuman cruelty. The most famous of these concerned his own sons. Hasan established a strict prohibition against alcohol in Alamut, punishing drunkenness with death. When one of his sons was accused of consuming wine, he didn't hesitate. He ordered his execution. It later emerged that the accusation was false, the result of an intrigue. Yet, the law was carried out. Hasan condemned another son, Muhammad, to death on suspicion of involvement in the murder of an important preacher. Evidence was scarce, but Hasan, obsessed with the idea of purity and order within his movement, chose to execute his son rather than allow the slightest doubt about his justice. This wasn't merely an act of justice. It was a political manifesto addressed to all followers. Before my law, all are equal. No one, not even my own blood, stands above the cause. The order is everything. Personal attachments are nothing. But what was the cost of this justice? What icy hell must have raged in the soul of a man who sacrifices his own children for an idea? The burden of power and the constant paranoia, inevitable for the leader of a clandestine organization, profoundly changed him. In his youth, Hasan had been a charismatic preacher, a wandering philosopher. But in Alamut, he transformed into a recluse, the old man of the mountain. Legends claim that during his 35 years of rule, he never once left the fortress, descending from his humble room to the roof only twice. He lived amidst books, maps, and intelligence reports, governing his invisible empire. This solitude at the pinnacle was absolute. He could trust no one, not even his inner circle. The power he created demanded that he become not a man, but a function, a ruthless command center, devoid of weaknesses and emotions. From an idealist dreaming of a just world, he became the high priest of a cult he himself had forged, and sacrifices were continually offered upon this altar. One of the most tragic was the story of Abu Tahir al-Saig. He was one of Hasan's first and most devoted comrades, a brilliant jeweler who used his craft as a cover for preaching in cities. He was instrumental in paving the way for the capture of many fortresses in Syria. But over time, his views began to diverge from Hasan's rigid line. He believed it was time to move from targeted strikes to more open political struggle. This was interpreted as insubordination, a threat to the unity of doctrine. Abu Tahir was recalled to Alamut, accused of heresy, and executed. The man who helped build the order was ground to dust by its very gears. This story lays bare the darker side of Hassan's genius. He didn't just create a secret service, he forged a totalitarian system that tolerated no dissent. Within the order, there was no room for discussion or doubt. There was only the will of the Sayyidna, the master, which was law. The discipline that was their strength in the outside world became, internally, a tool for suppressing all opposition. The Fidai, who sacrificed themselves for a higher cause, were merely the tip of the iceberg. Beneath them were thousands of others whose lives, ambitions, and even thoughts were sacrificed to a grand idea formulated by one solitary man. Hasan-i Sabbah died of old age in his own bed in Alamut, leaving behind a perfectly functioning mechanism. But he paid a terrible price. He lost family, friends, and perhaps that part of himself that was once merely human. He became the living embodiment of his doctrine, a cold, calculating, and utterly solitary genius whose legacy remains forever stained not only by the blood of his enemies, but also by that of his loved ones. When these two worlds collided, the world of imperial Sunni order and the world of revolutionary Ismaili underground, it was nothing like a dialogue of cultures. It was the clash of two tectonic plates with utterly distinct geologies. Look at their architecture. Seljuk civilization expressed itself horizontally, in the boundless courtyards of Isfahan's mosques, in luxurious caravanserais, in squares open to every wind. Their architecture screamed power, wealth, and publicity. Alamut and the other Nizari fortresses were its complete antithesis. This was the architecture of the vertical, a fortress fused with the rock, reaching for the sky, introverted. It wasn't a city, but an anti-city, not a center of power, but its hidden nerve center. It was an architectural manifesto carved in stone. We are different. We are inside. We are above you. This conflict permeated everything. In the language of the Seljuks, High Persian poetry and the Arabic of the Quran, in its direct, literal reading, dominated. The Nizaris, however, created their own language within a language, full of codes, allegories, and secret meanings. Their doctrine divided the world into an outer shell, the Zahir, accessible to the uninitiated, and an inner, hidden essence, the Batin, accessible only to the initiated. This was a war for the very meaning of words, for the soul of sacred texts. For the Sunni theologian, the Quran was a clear and unambiguous law. For the Ismaili preacher, it was a bottomless ocean of symbols, the keys to which belonged only to their imam. But even amidst such total war, the most astonishing and strange hybrids were born. In the intellectual laboratories of Alamut, in its legendary library, an incredible synthesis took place. Hasan-i Sabbah and his followers weren't merely mystics, they were radical rationalists. They took the legacy of ancient Greek philosophy, the logic of Aristotle, the metaphysics of Plato and the Neoplatonists, and fused it with Shia esoteric thought. They used the sharpest scalpel of rationalism to dissect what they believed to be the mystical heart of the universe. Their faith was not blind, it was evidentiary, built upon the most complex philosophical constructs. This was the most powerful intellectual hybrid of its era, a volatile mixture of mystical insight and cold logic. And in Syria, where the Nizaris found themselves squeezed between Sunni emirates and Crusader states, this hybridity spawned true political mutations. The Syrian assassin leader, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain, was a master of impossible alliances. He, the leader of a radical Shia sect, unhesitatingly forged tactical alliances with Christian Knights Hospitaller against a common enemy, the Sunni Sultan Saladin. In this boiling cauldron of the Levant, ideological purity yielded to the pragmatism of survival. The enemy of my enemy is my temporary ally, even if he is an infidel. This was an absolutely new, hybrid form of diplomacy, shocking to contemporaries. But how did all of this change the life of an ordinary person? Imagine a peasant living in the valley at the foot of Alamut. Yesterday, he paid taxes to a Seljuk collector who took a portion of his harvest and left, only to reappear a year later. His life was governed by the rhythm of the seasons and the sermons of the local Sunni mullah. Everything was simple, understandable, and unchanging. And then one day, the Seljuk garrison in the fortress above his head vanishes, and new masters appear. His life changes dramatically. Now, he is part of a new, insular world. His taxes don't go to a distant capital, but to maintain the garrison protecting his valley. His sons might be conscripted not into the Sultan's army, but into the fortress, to become part of something mysterious and grand. But the most profound transformation takes place within his mind. A da'i, a preacher, arrives at his home and begins to speak to him in an entirely different idiom. He explains that the world is not as it seems, that every word in the Quran holds a hidden meaning, that justice isn't found in allegiance to a distant sultan, but in loyalty to the true imam. Old habits and beliefs begin to crumble. From a simple peasant, he transforms into a member of a secret society, a bearer of a great truth. His world, once flat and predictable, gains depth and a hidden layer. He begins to live at the confluence of civilizations, not geographically but mentally, and this rift cuts directly through his very soul. Hasan-i Sabbah was no mere strategist. He was a brilliant public relations maestro who, centuries ahead of his time, grasped the fundamental law of power. Reality is what people believe it to be. And he deliberately set about constructing a myth around himself and his order. His own reclusion became his primary tool. For 35 years, he never left Alamut. This spawned a myriad of rumors. He became not just a man, but a legend, the unseen and all-knowing old man of the mountain. It was said he had mastered arcane sciences, that he could read minds across distances, that his agents were omnipresent. And the less he was seen, the more people believed in his supernatural powers. He transformed his absence into a presence, becoming an ubiquitous phantom that hovered over the thrones of sultans and emirs. Furthermore, he masterfully exploited the public nature of his enemies' executions, turning them into sensational media events. A dagger thrust in a crowded mosque wasn't just a murder, it was a performance. A fida'i, who didn't even attempt to flee but embraced death with a smile, became living proof of their indomitable spirit. Each such act broadcast a simple yet chilling message. Our people do not fear death. Do you? This was propaganda of the deed, far more effective than any written word. They didn't merely speak of their might. They demonstrated it in the most shocking ways, forging an image of inescapable destiny. Naturally, their enemies weren't idle. They launched a formidable counter-propaganda campaign, a true masterclass in black PR. And the primary weapon in this war became one single word: hashishin. They began to be called hashish users. This label was a stroke of genius. First, it dehumanized the enemy, transforming ideological fighters into drug-addled degenerates. Second, it offered a simple and convenient explanation for their superhuman fearlessness. They weren't true believers, they were merely high. This myth, born in Sunni theological circles, proved incredibly infectious. Merchants, pilgrims, and then the Crusaders all picked it up, carrying it to Europe. And it is this enemy-created myth, not the Order's self-appellation, that has survived to this day and become their historical name. But the most striking illustration of how history is written by the victors is the Mongol conquest of Alamut itself. The official version, penned by Persian historians at the Mongol court, states, Khan Hulagu, a wise and formidable ruler, offered the young and indecisive Imam Kursha an honorable capitulation. The Imam, recognizing the futility of resistance, wisely accepted the offer, surrendering the fortress and sparing the lives of his people. It's a beautiful tale of the conqueror's mercy and the vanquished's prudence. However, archaeology and the analysis of surviving fragments of Nizari texts paint an entirely different picture. Archaeological excavations at Alamut reveal traces of a fierce assault and fire, not a peaceful handover. Most likely, there was no mercy whatsoever. The Mongols, bringing with them Chinese engineers, subjected the fortress to a massive bombardment from previously unseen catapults. When it became clear that the walls were about to fall, Kursha, to avoid a total massacre of women and children, was forced to surrender. And what happened next? Hulagu compelled him to travel to all the other fortresses and order their surrender. But once the last stronghold fell, the Imam and his entire family were treacherously murdered. This was followed by an order for the total genocide of all Nizaris they could find. The official history, written in service to the Mongols, simply concealed the monstrous act of betrayal and genocide, replacing it with a noble tale of a wise ruler. The truth was buried alongside thousands of victims at the foot of Alamut. The system crafted by Hasan-i Sabbah was built on balance. Iron discipline and absolute faith were tools to achieve a concrete political goal, the survival and establishment of their state in a hostile world. But half a century after his death, in 1164, his great-grandson, the fourth ruler of Alamut, named Hasan II, made a decision that detonated this balance from within. This wasn't a tactical miscalculation or a political blunder. It was a theological atomic bomb, known as the proclamation of the Qiyamah, the resurrection. Hasan II declared to his followers that the era of religious law, the Sharia, was over. The hidden, esoteric truth was now revealed, and the righteous no longer needed external rituals and prohibitions. Paradise had arrived, here and now, in Alamut. This was a fatal decision that irreversibly distorted the original vision. Hasan the founder had created an order of warrior intellectuals to contend in the real world. His great-grandson transformed it into a community of mystics living in a spiritual paradise detached from that world. The objective, the establishment of justice on earth, was replaced by a declaration that earthly struggle was no longer meaningful. A tool of survival became a tool of escapism. A great political doctrine began to mutate into an esoteric cult. This was the moment when means, honed to perfection, discipline, faith, self-sacrifice, suddenly became aimless because the goal was declared achieved. This move caused a profound internal schism. Not everyone was ready for paradise. For the old guard, for the veteran preachers raised on Hasan-i Sabbah's stern code, this was pure madness, heresy. One of them, an old commander who remembered tales of the founder's iron discipline, looked upon the jubilant youth celebrating the abolition of prayers and fasting, and saw not enlightenment, but the beginning of decay. To him, it was a betrayal of everything they had fought for. The conflict between the old pragmatist, for whom faith was a weapon, and the new mystic, for whom faith became an end in itself, was inevitable, and it ended in blood. Hasan II himself was murdered by his brother-in-law, a representative of the order's old aristocracy, who could not reconcile himself with this blasphemy. But the point of no return had already been crossed, and the symbolic act that marked this turning point was the very ceremony of the Qiyamah proclamation. On the appointed day, Hasan II ordered a pulpit, a minbar, to be erected in Alamut. But he positioned it so that it faced not south towards the holy city of Mecca, as dictated by a 1,000-year tradition of Islam, but in another direction entirely. Then he ascended it and delivered his sermon, declaring the abolition of the law. This turning his back on Mecca was more than just a breach of ritual. It was a shocking, deliberate break with the entire Islamic world. This was a symbolic gesture that spoke louder than any words. We are no longer part of your world. Our paths have diverged. We have our own Kaaba, our own paradise, our own law, or rather, the absence of law. In that moment, the fortress built to change the world declared that it was no longer a part of it. The order, which had been a scalpel threatening the heart of empires, voluntarily transformed into an isolated monastery, immersed in mystical contemplation. And while the political and military machine of the assassins continued to operate by inertia for almost another century, its ideological heart stopped on that day. When the smoke cleared over the ruins of Alamut, an entirely new world came into view. And in this world, there were clear winners and losers. The losers were everyone connected in any way to the Nizaris. Their ruling dynasty was utterly eradicated. Their intellectual elite, scholars, preachers, commanders, custodians of a unique doctrine, was physically annihilated. Tens of thousands of ordinary followers in the mountain valleys were either killed or scattered across the globe. An entire social stratum, an entire civilization that had been building for almost 2 centuries, simply ceased to exist. It was wiped off the map. But there were also winners. Chief among them, of course, were the Mongols, who became the new masters of these lands. Yet there were other hidden beneficiaries, the Orthodox Sunni clergy. For almost 200 years, they had lived in fear and hatred of the heretics, writing polemical treatises against them and calling for jihad. And now, at the hands of pagan Mongols, their centuries-old problem had been solved in the most radical way imaginable. The enemy they could not conquer was exterminated. For them, it was a triumph, a divine retribution, even if accomplished by foreign swords. On the ruins of the Nizari state, they began to reassert their authority over minds. The economy of this new world was literally built on bones. All the material wealth accumulated by the order over 2 centuries was plundered. Gold and jewels from Alamut's treasuries went to pay the Mongol army and finance its further campaigns. But the most terrifying and irreplaceable loss was the destruction of the Alamut library. This was not merely an act of vandalism, it was an act of economic sabotage against the future. Unique works on philosophy, medicine, and astronomy were burned, not to mention the invaluable archives of the order itself. The knowledge that was their primary capital turned to ash. Trade routes and centers of power on the world map were instantly redrawn. The mountain fortresses, which had been the nerve centers of an entire transnational network, overnight became useless ruins. Power and money now concentrated in new Mongol capitals, Marageh, Tabriz, Sultaniya. The unique Nizari financial system, based on the secret collection of religious taxes, evaporated. The economic mechanism that had fueled asymmetrical warfare for 2 centuries was broken forever. But the deepest shock was psychological. For the surviving Nizaris, it was an absolute catastrophe, an apocalypse. Their world had collapsed. Impenetrable fortresses had fallen. The infallible Imam was dead. The promised paradise on earth had turned into a hell of slaughter. This triggered a profound crisis of faith to which the doctrine of taqiyya, the total concealment of one's beliefs for survival, became the answer. From proud and fearless warriors who changed the course of history, they transformed into invisible people, forced for centuries to pretend to be Sunnis or Sufis, secretly passing their faith from generation to generation. Their worldview shifted from offense to staunch defense. For the rest of Persian society, the fall of Alamut became the final crushing proof of one simple truth. Resistance to the Mongols was futile. If even the legendary assassins, feared by sultans and kings, were pulverized, what chance did an ordinary city or principality have? This triggered a wave of collective depression and fatalism, breaking the will to resist. The euphoria of being rid of terrorists quickly gave way to a chilling terror of the new, far more fearsome overlords. A new era dawned, an era of survival under the dominion of a force with which one could neither negotiate nor hide. To grasp what drove a fidai to certain death, it's not enough to talk about faith. One must crack open the very operating system of that faith. The central idea that governed everything in the Nizari world was the concept of two levels of reality, Zahir and Batin. Zahir is the outer, visible, exoteric world. It's the literal reading of the Quran, the rituals, the laws, the world inhabited by ordinary people and their Sunni rulers. But beneath this shell, like the kernel of a nut, lies the Batin, the inner, hidden, esoteric truth, accessible only to the chosen few. And the key to this truth, the only key, lay in the hands of the living, infallible Imam. Ordinary human reason, according to their doctrine, was insufficient to grasp divine truth. A teacher was needed. This doctrine of authoritative teaching, or ta'lim, was the philosophical bedrock of absolute obedience. A fida'i, in slaying an enemy, was not committing a sin. He was fulfilling the will of the one who alone saw true reality. The intellectual powerhouse that forged this intricate theology into a weapon was none other than Hasan-i Sabbah himself. While we often picture him as a cunning strategist or a charismatic cult leader, he was, first and foremost, a top-tier philosopher and intellectual. He wasn't merely an executor of plans, he was the architect of the new preaching, a reformed Ismaili doctrine meticulously honed for revolutionary struggle. His cell at Alamut wasn't a command center, it was a research and development institute. Surrounded by books, he sharpened his arguments, penned treatises, and engaged in fierce polemics with his adversaries. He crafted a system where intellect was valued no less than valor. It was he who reasoned why assassinating a tyrant wasn't a sin, but an act of supreme justice, and why submission to the Imam wasn't slavery, but the highest form of freedom, a liberation from the shackles of an imperfect human mind. This potent and seductive doctrine faced an equally formidable intellectual adversary, the philosophy of the Seljuk Empire. This was a world of orthodox Sunnism, resting upon three foundational pillars: the Quran, the tradition of the Prophet, and the consensus of the theological community. It was a philosophy of order, stability, and law. It posited that truth was open and accessible to all through the study of sacred texts and adherence to the example of the righteous. The Sultan's authority within this framework was sacred, as he was seen as the earthly guardian of this divine order. For them, Ismaili heresy wasn't mere dissent. It was an outright rebellion against the very fabric of creation, an attempt to plunge the world into chaos. This clash of ideas was far from abstract. It had its generals. If Hassan was the intellectual engine of the Nizari movement, his chief antagonist wasn't merely the vizier Nizam al-Mulk, but also the greatest philosopher of that era, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. The Seljuk authorities, quite literally, commissioned him to pen a philosophical refutation of the Ismaili doctrine. And al-Ghazali produced his masterpiece, The Disgrace of the Batinites, where, employing impeccable Aristotelian logic, he systematically dismantled their teachings. This was a genuine war of minds. Al-Ghazali argued that the doctrine of an infallible teacher led to intellectual slavery, while the true path lay in a synthesis of faith and reason, accessible to everyone. Thus, beyond the battlefields and beneath the shadow of palace intrigues, a far deeper war was being waged. It was a dispute over the very nature of truth and the means of its apprehension. On one side stood a hierarchical, elitist system, asserting that truth was a secret held by a singular individual. On the other, an open democratic system declared that truth was enshrined in law and tradition, and it was everyone's duty to study and adhere to it. One philosophy bred revolutionaries and secret societies. The other, empire builders, lawgivers, and custodians of order. And though the Nizari state was physically obliterated, this ideological struggle did not cease. The philosophy of order and law, meticulously refined by al-Ghazali, became the backbone of the Sunni world for centuries to come. But the notion of a secret order possessing hidden knowledge and reshaping the world from the shadows went underground. It didn't die. It merely lay dormant, only to resurface time and again in other doctrines, other secret societies, and other epochs, proving that ideas are the most resilient force in human history. The fall of Alamut was not the end. It was merely the beginning of its agony. The grand system crafted by Hasan-i Sabbah didn't perish instantly under the blows of Mongol battering rams. Its death was prolonged and agonizing. And most terrifyingly, immediately after the destruction of its physical heart, the system began to devour itself from within. The Mongols had annihilated the brain, but the nervous system continued to convulse for some time before finally expiring. With no external enemy left to finish off the remnants, the scattered cells of the order turned against one another. The centralized structure that had been their greatest strength became a fatal vulnerability. Without Alamut, without a living imam, without the library that served as the repository and benchmark of their doctrine, the order became blind and deaf. The unified network fractured into dozens of isolated communities across Persia, Syria, and India. Each of them now believed itself to be the sole guardian of the true faith. An era of entropy had begun. The single scalpel-sharp vision splintered into thousands of contradictory interpretations. And it was here that the most ferocious and tragic struggle for their legacy commenced. This wasn't a battle for castles or gold, for those were long gone. This was a fight for the very soul of the teaching. Various preachers declared themselves representatives of the hidden imam. Different dynasties laid claim to spiritual leadership. Yesterday's comrades in arms now accused one another of heresy and betrayal. The grand idea that had united people from Syria to the Pamir Mountains was torn to shreds, with each heir attempting to pull its remnants over themselves, claiming to be the true successor of the old man of the mountain. This internal strife made them easy prey. The new rulers of the region, the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria, the Mongol Ilkhanates in Persia, methodically purged what remained. They no longer feared a dagger from the shadows. What they saw before them wasn't a unified, formidable force, but rather disparate, warring sects that could be picked off one by one. A system built on fear had ceased to inspire it, thereby losing its very reason for being. Yet, one fragment of the grand past still fought on desperately. This was the Syrian branch of the order. Relatively autonomous even during Alamut's heyday, it survived its fall and remained the last bastion of Nizari statehood. Their fortresses, Masyaf, Al-Kaf, and others, still stood, and their fidais still struck terror into their neighbors. This was the final stronghold, the last bearer of that original idea of armed resistance. But against them marched a new kind of enemy, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars. He was no mere general. He was a genius of asymmetric warfare, having risen from slave to sovereign himself. He perfectly understood the assassins' logic and decided to fight them with their own weapons. Instead of frontal assaults, he employed intrigue, bribery, and sowed discord among the leaders of the Syrian Nizaris. He formed alliances with them, only to betray them. He intercepted their messengers, pitted them against one another, and only then, once their will was broken and their unity shattered, did he proceed to systematically choke them out. In 1273, after a long and cunning campaign, the last significant fortress of the Syrian assassins, Al-Kaf, fell. Its demise was not heroic. There was no grand battle. Baybars simply cut it off from all supply lines and forced its surrender. The last fidais were disarmed and transformed into the Sultan's personal guard, a humiliating end for those who had once shaped the destinies of empires. This quiet, inglorious finale marked the true end of an era. The last bearer of the original idea did not die in battle. It was absorbed and digested by a stronger, more cunning system. The assassin state perished, and its idea, shattered into 1,000 fragments, retreated into a deep, centuries-long underground existence. After the Mongols and Mamluks extinguished the last embers of the Nizari state, an era of great silence descended. The history of the assassins, as a real political and intellectual phenomenon, vanished beneath the waves. Their libraries were burned, their archives destroyed, their teachings became a secret, whispered in the deep underground. On the surface, only a distorted, grotesque echo remained, a myth crafted by their enemies. For nearly 5 centuries, to both the European and Muslim worlds, the assassins existed only as a boogeyman, a tale of fanatic drug addicts and their treacherous old man of the mountain. The authentic story was not merely forgotten. It was supplanted by a dramatic and convenient falsehood. This was a complete, almost total, oblivion. The moment of rediscovery dawned only at the cusp of the 18th and 19th centuries, curiously enough, sparked by a cannon. When Napoleon's army invaded Egypt and Syria, it brought not only soldiers, but also scholars. Europeans gained direct access to Arabic chronicles and sources for the first time. And among these dusty manuscripts, the contours of an entirely different history began to emerge. The French Orientalist Sylvestre de Sacy was the first to scientifically challenge the legend of hashish. Analyzing Arabic texts, he hypothesized that the word assassin derived not from hashishin, but from asas, meaning foundation, which fundamentally transformed the image from a drug-addled fanatic to an ideological fundamentalist. This was the first ray of light to pierce the dark crypt of the myth. But the real revolution unfolded in the 20th century. Scholars, such as the Russian Orientalist Vladimir Ivanov and later Farhad Daftari, accomplished the impossible. They began to unearth what was considered forever lost, authentic Ismaili manuscripts that had survived the Mongol devastation. These texts were secretly spirited away from Alamut and preserved for centuries in private libraries in Iran, India, and Syria. And when these texts were finally translated, the effect was like an explosion. For the first time in 700 years, the assassins spoke in their own voice. And in that voice, there was not a word of hashish or paradise gardens. Instead, it articulated a complex philosophy, a cold political strategy, and an iron logic. History began to rewrite itself. However, as often happens, new eras interpreted this rediscovered history in entirely their own ways, imbuing it with meanings that were never there. In the 19th century, during the age of Romanticism, the assassins suddenly transformed into mysterious and noble rebels, freedom fighters against tyranny, heroes of secret societies. Their complex theology and state ambitions were discarded, while the romanticized image of a lone, hooded figure defying the world took center stage. In the 20th century, their image mutated once again. Some radical political movements saw them as harbingers of propaganda by deed, precursors to modern revolutionary terrorists. Yet this too was a profound misconception. The assassins killed to build and protect their theocratic state. The anarchists of the 19th century killed to destroy any state whatsoever. Their goals were diametrically opposed, and in the 21st century, their final and most resounding reincarnation occurred as pop culture heroes. The Assassin's Creed game series took historical facts and spun them into a global myth about the assassins' eternal struggle for freedom against the enslaving Templars. Millions of people worldwide accepted this beautiful fantasy as gospel. Thus, having traversed centuries of oblivion, scientific rediscovery, and a series of misinterpretations, the history of the assassins came full circle. Born as a complex reality, it once again became a myth. But this time, a heroic myth, incredibly popular and infinitely far removed from the somber and brilliant truth. And here we are at the end of our investigation. We've journeyed from the opening salvo to the final tragic chord. We began with a seemingly simple question. Who were the assassins? Drug-addled fanatics or geniuses of asymmetric warfare? We cracked the code of Alamut, separated truth from myth, and it seems, found an answer. But, as is often the case, the answer to one question begets another, far deeper and more unsettling. The history of the assassins, having completed its grand cycle, returns us to the very problem with which it all began, but now on a new, global scale. And this problem, you see, is the eternal struggle between inconvenient, complex truths and simple, seductive falsehoods. Hasan-i Sabbah inhabited a world where news and knowledge crawled along at the pace of a camel caravan. Today, we inhabit a world where information zips around at the speed of light. Yet, has the battlefield truly shifted? Today, we are bombarded by rumors, propaganda, and artfully constructed myths, just as the Seljuk vizier once was. Only now, these aren't delivered by clandestine spies and fervent preachers, but by the relentless algorithms of social media and the screaming headlines of our news feeds. And just like those people of 900 years past, we find ourselves utterly defenseless against a compellingly crafted narrative. And it is precisely here that the core, unyielding paradox of this entire saga lies exposed. The order, which built its formidable power on a masterful command of information, on an esoteric understanding of the hidden nature of reality itself, ultimately proved utterly defenseless against the crudest and most elementary disinformation. Their brilliant doctrine, their profound philosophy, their tangible achievements, all of it was erased, supplanted by a grotesque caricature, a fiction concocted by their adversaries and amplified by a single Venetian merchant. They won hundreds of tactical battles, yet they ultimately lost the overarching strategic war, the war for the narrative. This defeat reveals less about them and more about us. We long to believe in an idyllic paradise and brainwashed fanatics because that version demands absolutely no intellectual heavy lifting from us. It's straightforward, easy to grasp, and exotically thrilling. The unsettling truth, however, is that their actions were fueled by cold, calculated precision, brilliant strategy, and an incredibly sophisticated philosophy. That truth is terrifying. It forces us to concede that history isn't solely propelled by brute force, but by the sheer power of ideas we may not fully grasp. In this sense, the Marco Polo myth is more than just a historical anecdote. It's an eternal archetype. It's every simplistic answer to a complex question. It's every conspiracy theory that claims to explain the entire world in a neat phrase. It's every political slogan that promises paradise on earth if we simply eliminate the foe. We are still far more willing to believe in the existence of simple evil than in the presence of complex and at times terrifying genius. Witnessing how a compelling lie has outlasted a complex truth by 7 centuries brings us to a final, most crucial question. Does our current era, with its boundless access to knowledge and instantaneous communication, grant us an advantage in this eternal struggle? Or are our technologies simply newer, more sophisticated tools for crafting and disseminating those very idyllic paradises we so desperately want to believe in, even when we know deep down they're nothing more than an illusion?